Welcome back to Whispered Stories, where we explore the darkest corners of the world through chilling tales of the unknown. Tonight, we're hitting the open road and stepping into the world of long-haul truckers. While many see the trucking lifestyle as a quiet, solitary journey through the highways of the world, there are disturbing stories whispered among truckers that would keep you up at night. From strange encounters to the eerie loneliness of remote truck stops, these are 3 disturbing true trucker horror stories that will make you think twice before your next road trip. Truckers often see things that others don't. Late at night, while most people sleep in their beds, these drivers are out on desolate highways, witnessing the strange, the eerie, and the unexplained. Our first story comes from a trucker named Tom, who encountered something that would forever change his view of picking up hitchhikers. It was around 3 a.m., the dead of night, when Tom found himself driving through a rural highway in the heart of the Midwest. The rain had been coming down hard for hours, making the drive treacherous and tiring. He could barely see past the reach of his headlights, and the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the windshield was the only thing keeping him company. The long stretches of road, lined with nothing but thick forest on either side, made the night feel even more oppressive. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure by the side of the road. A young woman, soaked from head to toe, stood shivering with her thumb out. Despite his instincts telling him to keep driving, Tom felt a pang of sympathy. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, and the rain was relentless. Reluctantly, he slowed the truck to a stop and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice barely cutting through the rain. The girl nodded silently, her face pale and her clothes clinging to her small frame. Without a word, she climbed into the cab, bringing with her the sharp scent of rain and cold air. Tom tried to engage her in conversation as they drove, asking where she was headed, but her answers were vague. She simply said, "Down the road a bit," and offered no more details. Her voice was soft, almost monotone, as if she were in a daze. The more Tom tried to get her to talk, the more uneasy he became. Something about her felt off. He glanced over at her occasionally, noticing that she was staring straight ahead, never blinking, never shifting in her seat. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white, as if she were gripping something invisible. After a few miles, Tom began to regret picking her up. There was a palpable tension in the air, and his unease only grew the further they drove. Suddenly, without warning, she broke the silence. "You missed the turn," she said in a flat, emotionless tone. Tom frowned. He hadn't seen any turn-off or exit for miles. Confused, he looked back at her, but what he saw sent a chill down his spine. The passenger seat was empty. He slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the road, heart pounding. Tom frantically looked around, searching for any sign of the girl. His mind raced. Had she jumped out without him noticing? But the door had never opened, and the seatbelt was still fastened. She had simply vanished. Breathing heavily, Tom pulled over to the side of the road, trying to calm himself down. His hands were shaking as he turned off the engine and sat in silence, listening to the rain pounding against the roof of the cab. For a long time, he didn't move, too stunned to process what had just happened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he gathered the courage to drive again. He reached the next truck stop, where he parked and stumbled into the diner, still shaken by the experience. Inside, he recounted his story to another trucker, an older man who had been on the road for decades. As Tom spoke, The man's expression darkened, and he leaned in closer. "You're not the first to see her," the old man said quietly. "They call her the vanishing hitchhiker. She's been haunting this stretch of road for as long as I've been driving. No one knows who she is or where she came from, but every so often, someone picks her up. And just like with you, she disappears before reaching her destination." Tom felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He had heard ghost stories before, but nothing like this. That night, he swore he'd never pick up another hitchhiker again. The life of a trucker can be isolating, especially in the dead of night when you're the only vehicle on the road for miles. This next story comes from a driver named Mark, who found himself in a terrifying cat-and-mouse game with a truck that shouldn't have existed. Mark had been on the road for over 15 years, driving cross-country routes that took him through every kind of terrain imaginable. He prided himself on his ability to stay calm under pressure, whether it was navigating through blizzards in the Rockies or handling breakdowns in the sweltering heat of the desert. But nothing could have prepared him for what he encountered one night on a long, lonely stretch of highway in the Pacific Northwest. It was around midnight when Mark first noticed the headlights behind him. At first, they seemed like any other truck's lights, slowly gaining on him from a distance. But something about them felt wrong. They were too close, almost as if the driver had no regard for safety. Mark could feel the intense brightness of the high beams reflecting in his mirrors, and despite trying to speed up to put some distance between them, the headlights stayed unnervingly close. Frustrated, Mark tried to signal the other truck to pass, but it didn't budge. The lights stayed right on his tail, making him feel as though he was being hunted. Unease started to gnaw at him. Truckers have a sort of code on the road, a mutual respect for the size and power of their rigs. Tailgating was not just reckless, it was dangerous. As the minutes dragged on, the situation grew more bizarre. Mark slowed down, hoping the truck would finally take the hint and pass him. Instead, the headlights swerved to the left, pulling up alongside his rig. Mark stole a glance at the other truck, expecting to see a driver glaring back at him. But what he saw instead made his heart stop. There was no one behind the wheel. The truck was massive, a hulking behemoth of a rig, but the cab was empty. The wheel spun on its own as the truck roared down the highway at breakneck speed. Mark's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. There was no driver. The truck was driving itself. Terrified, Mark tried to pull over, but the phantom truck matched his every move, staying beside him. Its empty cab, a haunting sight. For what felt like hours, the truck played this eerie game with him, never passing, never backing off. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the truck vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. No screech of tires, no fading headlights. It simply blinked out of existence, leaving Mark alone on the highway, shaken to his core. When he finally made it to a truck stop, Mark told his story to anyone who would listen. Most dismissed it as exhaustion or a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road, but there were a few who looked at him with knowing eyes. "That's the phantom truck," one old-timer said. "It's been haunting these roads for years. Some say it's the ghost of a trucker who died in a wreck, never making it home. Now, it roams the highways, forever chasing other drivers." Mark never saw the phantom truck again, but the memory of that night still haunts him every time he hits the road. He'll never forget the sight of that driverless rig and the feeling of sheer helplessness as it taunted him on the open road. Our final story takes us to the desolate deserts of Nevada, where the vast stretches of sand and rock are as isolating as the open ocean. Truckers traveling through these remote areas often find themselves miles from the nearest town, with only the distant horizon and the oppressive heat for company. But for one trucker named Paul, the desert held more than just emptiness. It held something dark and inexplicable. Paul had been on a long-haul trip from California to Utah, a route that took him through some of the most barren landscapes in the country. The sun had long since set, and the desert night was pitch black, with no streetlights or signs of civilization for miles. His headlights cut through the darkness, but beyond the glow of his truck, there was nothing but endless desert. After hours of driving, Paul decided to stop at a small remote rest area to refuel and take a quick break. The rest area was one of those lonely, barely maintained spots with a single gas pump and a dingy little diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. As he stepped out of his truck and stretched, he noticed something strange, a figure standing at the edge of the desert just beyond the reach of the rest area's dim light. The figure was tall and thin, almost skeletal, and stood completely still, as if it were watching him. Paul squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was too far away. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, a dark silhouette against the night. Uneasy, Paul quickly filled his tank and made his way into the diner, hoping for some food and maybe a bit of conversation to shake off the eerie feeling. Inside, the diner was just as run down as he had expected, with faded linoleum floors and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. The only other person there was the old woman behind the counter, who gave him a tired smile as he sat down. Paul couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and after a few minutes, he mentioned the figure outside to the woman. Her smile faded, and she gave him a long, hard look before speaking. "Oh, that's just the shadow," she said casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "It shows up from time to time, never gets closer, just watches. But you don't want to linger too long once you've seen it." Paul tried to laugh it off, but the look in her eyes was dead serious. He hurried through his meal, eager to get back on the road. As he stood up to leave, he glanced out the window. The figure was still there, but now it was closer, just a few yards away from his truck. A cold wave of fear washed over him. He grabbed his keys and hurried outside, heart pounding in his chest. The figure remained still, its hollow eyes seeming to follow his every move. Paul didn't waste any time. He jumped into his truck, fired up the engine, and sped away from the rest area as fast as he could. Even after putting miles between himself and the rest stop, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. The night was eerily quiet, and every shadow cast by his headlights seemed to stretch out longer than it should. He drove until dawn, too scared to stop, his mind replaying the sight of that figure over and over. To this day, Paul refuses to stop at any rest areas in the desert. He's convinced that whatever was watching him that night wasn't human, and he's not willing to find out what would have happened if he'd stayed a little longer. If you enjoyed tonight's episode of Whispered Stories, be sure to subscribe for more terrifying tales from the shadows. And remember, the next time you're driving late at night, you might not be alone. Stay safe out there.